Welcome back to the deep dive. And I'm going to be honest with you. Right up front today is going to be difficult.
It is, I think,
Yeah.
in a very necessary way, though.
Usually when we sit down to talk about a political presidency, especially one as volatile as the first term of Donald Trump, or even what we're seeing at the beginning of the second term here in early 2026, we're just wading through a swamp.
Total swamp. It's all emotion.
It's emotional, it's loud, you have, the resistance screaming on one side and the MAGA faithful screaming on the other, and the actual governance, the mechanics of what is actually happening to the country, it just gets lost.
It gets buried, completely buried. We trade in vibes, not facts. We trade in outrage, not analysis.
Exactly. But today, we are trying something kind of radical. We have a document on the desk in front of us. It's titled The Trump Report Card Integrated Actions Labels Evaluation.
It's a mouthful.
It's a very dry title.
It sounds like something you'd find in, like, the basement of the National Archives.
It really does. But the mission of this document is what's fascinating. It claims to be an audit, and I want to stick on that word for a second, an audit.
Yeah.
When the IRS audits you, they don't care if you're a nice person. They don't care if your neighbors like you or if you tell good jokes. They care about one thing.
The receipts.
The receipts. That's it.
That is the perfect analogy for this. The source material, it explicitly asks us to suspend what it calls our moral imagination. It argues that for the next hour, we just need to stop thinking like voters and start thinking like accountants. We're just looking at the ledger of the executive branch.
So what you're saying is we are stripping away the tweets, the rallies, the cable news freakouts.
Irrelevant, not part of the audit.
We're looking strictly at signed documents, verifiable outcomes, and institutional realities.
Precisely. The document calls this the TRC, the Trump Report Card.
Yeah.
And before we even get to the results, the grades on the card, we have to understand the methodology.
Right.
Because it's incredibly rigorous. It operates on a sequence that we are not allowed to mess with.
Okay, so walk me through it, because usually in media, we start with the headline, right? We start with the big flash of claim, and then we work backward to find evidence for it.
Right, and the TRC argues that's the entire problem. It uses a three-step process, and the order is everything. Step 1, actions.
Actions.
You list what physically happened. A law was signed, a barrier was built, a tax was cut, verifiable things.
Things you can photograph.
Exactly. Step 2, labels. Only after you have that full list of actions are you even allowed to look at the words we use in politics. Words like fascist, populist, nationalist, peacemaker.
Okay, so actions first, words second.
And then step 3 is synthesis. That's when you test the label against the action. Does the evidence from step 1 support the word from step 2?
I want to pause on that actions first rule. Why is that order so critical? Why can't I just say, okay, I think he's a populist, and then go look for evidence to back that up?
Because of how the human brain works. Specifically, confirmation bias.
Right.
The source argues that our political analysis is it's broken because we almost always start with the label. We decide a politician is a monster or a genius first.
Okay.
But once you have that label lodged in your head, it acts like a filter. Everything that person does, every action they take is twisted to fit the label you already chose.
So if I think he's monster and he signs, say, a peace treaty, I don't see the peace treaty. I immediately assume there's some nefarious secret motive behind it.
Exactly. You see a trick, you can't see the action clearly because the label is in the way. It's like wearing distorted glasses. The TRC forces us to invert that. You have to list the actions, the undeniable physical things that occurred in reality before you're allowed to apply a single adjective.
It sounds almost like a detox program for political junkies.
It is. That's what it felt like reading it. It's a discipline. And, for you listening, I'll just say this. This might feel uncomfortable.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Depending on where you stand politically. Just hearing a raw list of actions without the usual emotional cushioning we get from commentators, it can feel wrong. But that's the point. We're examiners today.
Not advocates.
Not advocates.
Okay. I'm ready. I think I'm ready to open the ledger. Let's start with section 1 of the document, the action record. We're looking at domestic and economic policy first.
Right. And a quick note on the framework here, just so we're all clear. The TRC defines an action very, very narrowly. It excludes what it calls speculative benefits.
Meaning what?
So we can't say this policy will create jobs in 10 years. That's a projection. It doesn't count in the audit.
Okay, and I'm guessing it excludes projected harms, too, like this might hurt the economy down the road.
Correct. We can't say this might destroy the environment in 20 years Again, that's a projection, a model. We are only looking at what was signed and what the immediate verifiable outcome was.
Just the facts on the ground.
That's it.
Okay. So let's look at the fiscal structure. The first big entry is obviously from the first term.
Yeah.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017.
Item number 1 on the list. The big one.
Now, we all remember the political fight over this. I mean, it was brutal. Democrats called it a giveaway to the rich. Republicans called it rocket fuel for the economy. But what does the audit say?
The audit it ignores the fight. It looks at the statute. The declared objective was, quote, reduce tax burden, increase competitiveness. The verifiable outcome. The corporate tax rate was, mathematically, reduced from 35% to 21%. Law enacted.
That's it. That's the whole entry.
That's the action. The rate changed, the money moved, end of story. Whether that was a good thing or a bad thing is a value judgment, which comes later. The fact is that the U.S. corporate tax structure was fundamentally altered.
It was a structural shift.
A huge one. It realigned how the U.S. economy interfaces with the global economy.
Okay, that's simple enough. But the audit then draws a line from that 2017 action to what we're seeing right now in early 2026 with the regulatory framework.
It does. It groups a couple of items together. There's the deregulatory framework, which is item 10, and the more recent 2026 cost workforce EOs, which is item 12. It sees them as one continuous project.
Deregulation is one of those words that gets thrown around in every campaign speech. I mean, every Republican since Reagan has promised it. Did it? Did it actually happen here?
The TRC says unequivocally yes. It highlights that during the first term, there was that 2-for-1 rule. For every new significant regulation an agency issued, they had to remove 2 old ones. It wasn't just a freeze on new rules. It was an active rollback.
Okay, so that was the first term.
And now, in 2026, we have the cost workforce executive orders.
What are those exactly? Because I saw the headlines, but it sounded like, administrative kind of boring stuff.
It is administrative, but that's where the real power lies. The objective listed in the TRC is reduce regulatory burden and federal workforce size. The outcome isn't just rhetoric. The audit notes that distinct directives were issued to all federal agencies to freeze hiring and identify specific programs for cuts.
So the action here isn't a promise, it's the signed order.
It's the initiation of a mechanical reduction of the administrative state. The orders are signed, the implementation is listed as ongoing, but the intent has moved from a speech to a binding legal document. This isn't just small government as a slogan, it's an attempt to physically reduce the headcount of the executive branch.
Right. Now, here's where I think the audit approach really, it really might surprise people. When you think of this administration, you often think of these hardline stances. Law and order, tough on crime, the American Carnage speech from the first inauguration.
Sure, that's the brand, that's the perception.
But then I look down the list here at item 2, the First Step Act from 2018.
This is a critical data point. If you're trying to build an honest, objective model of the presidency, it has to be in there.
So the First Step Act was, remind me, it was federal criminal justice reform.
The stated objective was to address sentencing disparities, particularly those that had disproportionately affected minority communities for decades.
Which is, that's usually a progressive talking point.
Exactly. The goal was to reduce mandatory minimums for nonviolent drug offenses and allow some prisoners to get out earlier for good behavior. And the outcome wasn't just a speech. It became law.
And it was implemented.
Actually implemented. The TRC notes that sentencing and prison reforms were carried out. Thousands of people, overwhelmingly African-American men, were released from federal prison as a direct result of that law.
It really counters the narrative that the entire platform is just purely punitive. If you're trying to build a caricature of a tyrant, tyrants usually fill the prisons. They don't typically sign bipartisan legislation to empty them.
It's a glitch in the matrix if your only lens is the authoritarian label. But if you're just looking at the action record, it's right there. Signed, sealed, delivered.
And speaking of glitches in the matrix, let's jump to the present day, 2026. Item 14 on the list. The Housing Market Executive Order.
Oh, this is the big one from recent months. This is the one that has the free market purists absolutely pulling their hair out.
This one jumped out at me because I had to double check that I was reading the right document. The objective is listed as, and I'm quoting here, limit institutional buyer advantage.
Correct. That's the language.
Explain that to me, because that sounds like something Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders would write. That sounds incredibly left-wing.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The core idea is that these massive hedge funds and huge institutional investors, like Blackstone, shouldn't be allowed to come in and buy up entire neighborhoods of single-family homes just to turn around and turn everyone into permanent renters.
Right.
The executive order, which was issued just recently, directs federal agencies to explore penalties or taxes or even outright limits on these massive corporate entities in the housing market.
Wait, I thought Republicans were supposed to be the party of the free market. If BlackRock wants to buy 1,000 houses, the pure free market ideology says, well, they can buy 1,000 houses.
Exactly. And this is where that traditional conservative label starts to peel off,
Yeah.
and we see the populist action underneath it. The action here is a direct government intervention in the market
To protect the little guy.
to protect, ostensibly, the individual home buyer against the massive corporate entity.
So just to get this straight, in the action record, we have tax cuts for corporations in 2017,
Yes.
but a potential crackdown on corporate housing buyers in 2026.
It looks contradictory if you view politics as a simple left versus right spectrum, but if you view it through the lens of the TRC, you see a specific type of governance emerge. It seems very transactional. It helps big business when it wants to spur growth, like with the tax cuts, but it will attack big business when it's perceived to be hurting the voter base, like with housing.
That is a very specific kind of pragmatism, or maybe cynicism, depending on your view.
It is. And it drives ideology purists on both sides crazy because it doesn't follow a textbook. But the audit doesn't care about ideology. It just records the action. The president signed an executive order to explore ways to restrict Wall Street from buying up Main Street homes.
Let's move to the physical record, something you can literally see. Immigration and borders. This is probably the most heated, most emotional topic in the public square. Item 9, the border wall program.
The most chanted about infrastructure project in modern American history, I think it's fair to say.
Build the wall, we heard it a million times, but looking at the audit, what actually got built? Because I remember the reporting at the time was all over the place. Some reports said it was just replacing old fences. Others said it was all new wall. It was a mess.
And the TRC just cuts right through that debate with a simple, hard number. The outcome is listed as approximately 450 miles of barrier system built or replaced.
450 miles, that's the hard number.
That is the hard number. Now, the critics will immediately say, well, a lot of that was just replacing old, dilapidated fencing that was already there.
Oh.
And the supporters will say replacing a 4-foot chain link fence that a child could hop over with a 30-foot steel bollard wall is new construction.
Right.
The audit doesn't care about that semantic debate. It just logs the physical change in the terrain. 450 miles of modern, formidable barrier exists now that did not exist in 2016.
So whether you think that is a triumph of national sovereignty or a moral failure is a label issue, which we'll get to later. The action record simply states the objective was to construct barriers. The outcome was 450 miles of barriers.
Precisely. And this pairs directly with the legal side of things. That's item 11, the 2025 Immigration Enforcement EO.
Right, so the physical wall is the hardware. Item 11 is the software that runs on it.
That's a great way to put it. The objective there is listed as strengthen vetting and intensify enforcement. The outcome in the TRC records two things: that the revised travel ban orders were eventually upheld by the Supreme Court in the first term, and that recent 2025 enforcement actions have been initiated to ramp up deportations. The machinery of enforcement, the actual ability of the state to deport and detain, was strengthened. That's the verifiable fact.
So on the domestic front, if we're trying to sum up this action record so far, we see a real mix. We see classic Republican policies like tax cuts and deregulation, but we also see criminal justice reform and direct market intervention in housing, and of course, significant physical construction and legal reinforcement on the border.
It's a record of significant executive activity. The gears of government were definitely turned, and often turned by executive order, to shift the direction of the country on multiple fronts. This wasn't a caretaker presidency by any stretch. It was an active interventionist presidency.
All right, let's cross the ocean. We're moving to Section 2, the action record for foreign policy and security.
Now, the source material makes a very specific claim here at the top of this section. It argues that foreign policy is the area most often compressed or flattened in public discourse.
What do they mean by compressed?
They mean that people tend to focus on the personality. You know, the strange handshake with Kim Jong-un, the angry tweets at NATO leaders, the insults, and they completely miss the structural strategy that might be underneath it all. They see the chaos, but they miss the architecture.
And the TRC, I'm guessing, tries to find that architecture. It focuses heavily on a term I see here called coercive diplomacy.
Yes, and to understand what that means in practice, we need to look at the trade international agreements first. Let's start with item 5, the USMCA.
This was the replacement for NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement.
Correct. And try to remember the rhetoric at the time. There was a lot of genuine fear that the U.S. was about to simply abandon free trade, tear up NAFTA with no replacement, and the entire North American economy would just collapse.
Right, that was the chaos narrative. He's going to blow up the global order.
But the action record shows something different. It just says ratified, entered into force July 1st, 2020. The outcome wasn't a vacuum. It wasn't the absence of a treaty. It was an updated, renegotiated, and ratified trade framework that ultimately passed with huge bipartisan support in Congress.
So the threat to blow it all up actually resulted in a new deal.
That is the coercive part of coercive diplomacy. You threaten to flip the entire table over so that you can get a better seat when everyone sits back down.
But sometimes he actually did flip the table. I'm looking at item 7, the Paris Agreement on Climate.
And the outcome there is just as clear. Withdrawal completed November 4, 2020. Objective. Exit framework viewed as unfavorable. This is a clear-cut case of the action matching the stated promise perfectly. He said he'd leave, he left. No renegotiation, just an exit.
And sticking with the economic side of foreign policy, we have the tariffs. Section 232 on steel and aluminum, that's item 4 and item 15 here.
The logic listed in the TRC was twofold: protecting domestic industry and increasing leverage in other negotiations. The outcome: tariffs were imposed. And, as predicted, retaliation did occur from China, Europe, and others. The audit notes the cost, that retaliation, but confirms the action was taken to deliberately shift the leverage dynamic. It was, for better or worse, the end of the post-Cold War consensus of free trade at all costs.
Now let's talk about war and peace, because this is where the action record really starts to deviate from the warmonger label that gets thrown around so often in political campaigns. I'm looking at item 16, non-engagement in new wars.
This is a really critical statistic in the TRC. The entry is brutally simple. No new major U.S. wars initiated during the term.
In the context of the 21st century, that is.
Yeah.
That's unusual.
It is statistically significant. I mean, if you look at the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy from 2001 to 2016, through both Bush and Obama, the expectation was consistent intervention. Iraq, Afghanistan, the intervention in Libya, the drone wars, getting involved in Syria. The TRC highlights this non-engagement as a specific action, a decision not to deploy troops on a massive scale.
Okay, but I have to play the skeptic here. Was it really non-engagement, or was it just not pacifism? Because he definitely authorized drone strikes. He bombed Syria a couple of times in response to chemical weapons attacks. Does that count as no new wars?
That's a great question. And the TRC defines war here as a major theater war, which means things like regime change operations or massive, sustained troop deployments for ground combat. And by that metric, the record holds. It absolutely wasn't pacifism, it was deterrence.
And I think that's the kind of nuance the audit is trying to find here. Let's look at item 17, the Iran maximum pressure campaign. This was not friendly. This was not pacifist.
Far from it. This is the textbook definition of the coercive diplomacy the source keeps mentioning. The objective was to deter Iran's nuclear development after leaving the Iran nuclear deal. The method wasn't invasion. It was economic strangulation.
So the outcome.
Sanctions were massively expanded. Iran's nuclear compliance, in turn, was reduced, which is a negative outcome if you supported the deal, but it's consistent with the administration's stated goals. But crucially, and the report really highlights this, there was no direct U.S.-Iran war.
That's the key. We strangled their economy, we put them under immense pressure, but we didn't send 100,000 troops to Tehran.
Correct. And that leads directly to item 18, the Soleimani strike in early 2020. I remember this vividly. I think everyone who was watching the news thought, this is it. This is World War III.
So the rhetoric at the time was apocalyptic. There's no other word for it.
But the audit just looks at the outcome. Strike executed. No subsequent direct war. The objective was listed as targeted military deterrence. The result was that, from the administration's perspective, deterrence was restored without escalating into a full-blown ground conflict. It's a very high-risk strategy. You're basically gambling that the other side won't or can't fight back. But the ledger shows that, in this instance, the risk paid off in terms of avoiding a wider war.
And then looking at the Middle East more broadly, we have item 8, the Abraham Accords.
This is perhaps the most under-discussed structural shift in the entire document, especially in the media.
Why do you say that?
Because for decades, the entire foreign policy establishment, Republican and Democrat, operated under one simple rule. You cannot have peace between Israel and the Arab states until you solve the Palestinian issue first. It was considered the key to the whole Middle East.
The golden rule of Middle East diplomacy.
The Abraham Accords just broke that rule. The action record shows normalization agreements signed with UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan. The administration essentially decided to bypass the Palestinian issue and instead forge a new regional coalition between Israel and the Arab Gulf states united against their common rival, Iran.
That is a massive geopolitical realignment.
It is. I mean, it fundamentally changed the map. And again, the outcome is verifiable. These are signed treaties, not just handshakes at a summit. Embassies were opened. Commercial flights started. It changed the entire strategic calculus of the region.
And finally, on the subject of alliances, we have item 22, NATO burden sharing.
This one is fascinating. The objective: increase allied defense contributions. The outcome: multiple NATO states increased spending. This creates a really interesting contrast. The rhetoric was often anti-NATO, calling the alliance obsolete, threatening to pull out.
Right.
But the actual outcome was a stronger, better-funded NATO, at least on paper.
That is a fascinating distinction. The rhetoric sounded like abandonment, but the structural result was reinforcement.
Exactly. He threatened to leave the club, so the other members started paying their dues. Coercive diplomacy in a nutshell.
Okay, so we've reviewed the actions, we have the raw data, we know what happened with taxes, the wars, the treaties. Now we move to Section 3 of the TRC, the label matrix. This is the institutional test.
This is the heart of the whole project.
Yeah.
This is where we take the words people use to describe the presidency, what the TRC calls the issuer logic, and we test them against the institutional reality that we just documented in the action record.
All right, let's start with the heavy hitters. The failed labels. According to the TRC, these are the words that simply do not hold up to scrutiny when you look at the evidence. And first up, the biggest one, fascist.
Okay, let's look at the claim. The issuer logic, the reason people use that word is that fascist means a kind of authoritarian nationalism that suppresses institutions and actively destroys democracy.
And the test result, according to the audit,
The TRC rules this very clearly. Criteria not met.
criteria not met. That is going to make some people very angry. I mean, they're going to point to the rhetoric, to the events of January 6th, to calling the press the enemies of the people. How does the audit reconcile that?
The audit doesn't look at rhetoric or even at specific events in isolation. It looks at the structure of the state. By academic definition, fascism requires the consolidation of absolute power and the removal of democratic checks and balances. It requires the abolition of elections or the suspension of the Constitution or the dissolution of opposition parties.
So did any of that happen?
The action record asks a simple checklist of questions. Were elections held? Yes, in 2018, 2020, 2022, 2024. Were political parties abolished? No. Did the courts remain open and independent? Yes. In fact, the courts frequently ruled against the administration's policies.
Right, he lost a lot of court cases, especially on immigration.
A dictator doesn't lose court cases. A dictator dissolves the court or packs it with loyalists who never rule against him. The very fact that the judicial branch remained an independent and operative check on executive power is the structural proof the audit uses to say the fascist label fails the test. The institution's held.
Okay. What about the word Nazi?
Well, Nazi implies a specific racialized totalitarian ideology. So the test asks, were there racial laws passed, like the Nuremberg laws? Was there an ethnic hierarchy codified into the legal system? Was there a one-party state established? The answer to all of these is a clear no. So criteria not met.
And anti-democratic. This one feels trickier because a lot of people feel it very strongly.
They do. But again, the TRC applies a structural test, not an emotional one. Were elections held? Yes. Were laws passed through the legislature? Yes, like the First Step Act. Were treaties ratified by the Senate? Yes, like the USMCA. Was there a suspension of democratic processes, like a declaration of martial law? No. So structurally, the government continued to function as a democracy, even if it was a very stressed and polarized one.
Okay, but what about authoritarian? The claim there is about an exercise of excessive power.
The TRC notes a really important nuance here. The claim is excessive power, but the test shows that the power was exercised overwhelmingly via lawful executive orders. When those EOs were challenged, the administration went to court. Sometimes they won, like with the travel ban. Sometimes they lost, like with DACA. But the act of participating in the court system is, by definition, the opposite of pure authoritarianism.
Right.
An authoritarian leader says, my word is law. This administration said, I think this is the law. Let's see what the Supreme Court says. It's a key distinction.
Okay, so those are the labels the TRC people says fail the test. What about the substantiated labels? What words actually fit the data?
Protectionist.
That makes sense.
The test result is clear. Tariffs were imposed on foreign goods. The USMCA was explicitly negotiated to protect North American labor. The label is substantiated by the record. He is, by the definition of the word, a protectionist.
Next one, nationalist.
Substantiated. The withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, the border policy, the constant pressure on NATO to have allies pay for their own defense. All of these actions align with the objective of prioritizing national sovereignty over multilateral commitments. The label fits the actions.
Anti-climate.
Confirmed by the Paris exit. The report is very direct here. If you define pro-climate policy as participating in the Paris framework, then the act of leaving it is structurally an anti-climate action.
And here's one that I think is interesting. Rule by executive.
The test result confirms high EO usage. There's no question. The administration relied heavily on executive orders to move its policy agenda forward. So if you say, this president rules by executive fiat, the data supports you. He didn't pass a lot of big legislation through Congress after 2017. He did a lot of it from his desk in the Oval Office.
Okay, now we have a third category here of complex labels. These are the ones that are sort of half-true or context-dependent. The first one is populist.
This is where that 2026 housing echo comes right back into play. The test result says that while some policies, like the tax cuts, were standard corporate republicanism, other key actions, like the deregulation efforts and especially the housing market intervention, were explicitly framed as a fight of the people versus the elites.
So, is he a populist or not?
The audit says, structurally, yes, in key moments. He has shown a willingness to use the power of the state to attack established elite institutions, like institutional homebuyers, in order to favor what he defines as the people. That is the textbook definition of economic populism.
What about polarizing?
The test result is, well, undeniable. The policies produced intensely polarized responses. They were not framed in a conciliatory way. They were designed to create a sharp contrast. So the label is accurate.
And finally, unilateralist, someone who acts alone on the world stage.
This result is listed as mixed, and it makes sense. Yes, sanctions on Iran and the tariffs were often applied unilaterally, the U.S. acting alone. But on the other hand, the Abraham Accords and the NATO pressure campaign were all about leveraging coalitions and treaties. So you can't say it was purely unilateral. The TRC calls it selectively unilateral.
This is really clarifying. It just takes the heat out of the language. Instead of screaming, he's a fascist or he's a saint, it's, well, the record doesn't support fascism, but it heavily supports protectionist nationalism with a strong reliance on executive orders.
Which is a much more boring sentence, but it is a much more accurate description of what actually happened.
So we've done the actions, we've done the labels. Now we move to the final section, section 4, synthesis and implications. What does this all mean when we put it together?
The TRC summary breaks it down into several key dimensions or grades for the report card.
Let's go through them. First up, executive power.
Rated as high, but, and this is the critical caveat, it's noted as being exercised within existing constitutional mechanisms. It pushed the boundaries of executive power, it absolutely stress-tested the fence, but the audit concludes it stayed inside the fence.
Okay. Conflict strategy.
This is characterized as a conflict pressure strategy, and this is the key takeaway for foreign policy. A high reliance on sanctions, on deterrence, and on coercive diplomacy, and a low reliance on large-scale troop deployment. It's a very specific doctrine. It prefers to squeeze economies rather than invade countries.
And rule of law.
The final assessment in the TRC states that the core institutions remained intact and operative. The system, while stressed, worked. The bureaucracy, the courts, the legislature, they all continued to function as checks on power. The system didn't break.
And there's a concept here that is really the philosophical core of this entire audit and maybe this deep dive. Label inflation risk.
This is the danger of our current political language. The TRC concludes that many of the most extreme labels we use, like fascist or dictator, they don't function as descriptions of reality. They function as warnings or moral signals.
What do you mean by that?
We say them because we are scared or angry, or because we want to signal to everyone else which side we are on. It's a tribal signal.
Right, it's like shouting fire. Not because you actually see flames, but because you smell some smoke and you want everyone to be on high alert.
Exactly. But the audit argues that when we use those alarmist labels as factual descriptions of institutional outcomes, we are, in effect, lying to ourselves and to each other. If we call a protectionist trade policy fascism, we lose the ability to understand what real fascism actually is. And we also lose the ability to critique the actual trade policy on its own merits.
Moral compression. That's the phrase the source uses. We compress a very complex structural reality into a single, simple moral judgment.
And in doing so, we completely miss the hidden record.
Tell me about the hidden record. What did we miss by focusing on the wrong labels?
The source argues that because we as a media and a public were so focused on the fascist debate or the tweet debate, we largely ignored the actual governance record, especially in foreign policy. The fact that the U.S. engaged in a maximum pressure campaign on Iran without triggering a full-scale war is a massive geopolitical case study.
Yeah.
But it was just drowned out by the daily noise.
And the Abraham Accords.
A fundamental shifting of alliances in the Middle East that broke with 50 years of diplomacy. And it was often treated as a footnote compared to the outrage of the day.
So the argument is that by mislabeling the presidency, we actually failed to understand it. We were fighting a phantom, a caricature, while the real administration was busy passing tax cuts, building a wall, and renegotiating the entire structure of Middle East alliances.
Precisely. And whether you support those actions or you oppose them, you should at least be opposing the actual actions, not a monster you've invented. If you hate the policies, then hate the policies. But don't invent a regime that doesn't actually exist just because it feels more emotionally satisfying to fight against it.
So if we step back, what is the value of this report card approach? I mean, why should someone listening who might be feeling very emotional about politics right now care about this dry structural audit?
Because real, effective engagement comes from clarity.
Hmm.
If you are angry, be angry at the specific executive order. Be angry at the 21% corporate tax rate. Be angry at the Paris withdrawal. But don't be angry at a label that doesn't fit the facts. And conversely, if you are a supporter, you should be able to support the actual results, the 450 miles of barrier, the judicial appointments, not just the personality.
It's about being an informed citizen rather than just an emotional reactor.
It's about the value of detachment. The source says it right there.
Yeah.
We need to be able to step back from the flashing news chyron and actually look at the signed document.
This has been a really refreshing way to look at recent history. It feels less like a fight and more like, well, like an audit.
That was the goal.
So here's the provocative thought we want to leave all of you with today. We just applied this TRC methodology to the Trump presidency, but what if we applied it to everyone?
That is the challenge, isn't it?
What if we took the administration of Barack Obama or George W. Bush or whoever comes next, and we stripped away all the rhetoric? What if we ignored their soaring speeches, ignored their vibes, ignored how nice or mean they seemed on television? What if we looked only at the signed documents and the verifiable, on-the-ground outcomes?
We might find that some of our perceived heroes were much more aggressive in their use of executive power than we thought. We might find that the nice guys started more wars than the mean guys, and some of our villains might have been far more constrained by the system than we ever feared.
If we looked only at the ledger, just the black and white of the audit, how would our understanding of the political world change? I have a feeling we would all be very surprised by the results.
I think we would. It would rewrite a lot of history.
Thanks for diving in with us. We'll see you next time.